I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we're going to try to tackle a timeless question. The question is this: why do bad things happen to good people? My next guest has written a book all about that. It is called Consider Job, and an inquiry concerning suffering, disbelief, and divine justice. It is written by Dennis Lyons, and we are delighted to have Dennis join us here today on Spotlight. Dennis, thank you so much for being our guest.
It's my pleasure.
So why don't we start with that first big question? It's such a weighted question. It's something that people have pondered and philosophized about for centuries. Why do bad things happen to good people?
This is one of these age-old mysteries we don't fully know. We have certain views and belief systems and perspectives. If you were, let's say, a Buddhist, you would just accept it as part and parcel of life as we live it. Because for a Buddhist would believe that all life is suffering. If you're a Muslim, you would rest securely in the hands of Allah because he controls everything and you just have to accept it. If you're a Christian, it becomes problematic because the Christian faith is one that promulgates the view that God is a long-suffering heavenly Father, in the way that a good father would tend and care for his children, so God tends for those of his own. Here is the problem. It would be okay if it was very, very clearly defined that those people who are not God's children, i.e. Christians, suffered and Christians had a good time. So there was a beneficial effect of being a Christian. That's not what we find in the universe. Now, we can go back in time and say, well, how has these views began to be evaluated? In 1707, there was an earthquake in Lisbon, and it led philosophers like Voltaire to question whether there is a just God in the universe. After all, if people in a church, which was the case, had suffered serious losses, why was it that they suffered serious losses when the rest of the population were pretty sound? These are questions that have gone on for a long, long time. So whether we're looking at the mudslide in Colombia or natural earthquakes, we can't fully answer this question, which is why Christians tend to go to the biblical book of Job.
Now, it's interesting, when I've spoken to theologians about this question of why do bad things happen to good people, they've often answered it's the fact that we have goodwill, free will rather, not goodwill. Some of us have goodwill, some of us have ill will, and that therein lies the problem, is that we're all free to do what we'd like to do, and some person's ill will encroach on someone else's goodwill, and so forth. Do you ascribe to that theory as well? It's our free will that makes this world sometimes a difficult place to navigate?
It's not altogether clear, is it? Because that may answer, for example, why President Putin is invading Ukraine, but it doesn't answer the question of the mudslide in Colombia, a natural disaster. It doesn't answer things like well, you can point to any kind of disasters that happen in the modern world and say, well, it seems as though it's dictated by nature. And yet, if God is the author of creation, why is it these things seem to happen to people, who are righteous, should we say, or very charitable? If you were a non-Christian, if you was a secular-minded citizen, you would probably just see it as part of the natural world. So various writers have juggled with this. There's a well-known theologian in the States there, in Chapel Hill University, Bart Ehrman, his name is, and he's a very eminent theologian, and he had written a book about this, and it led him to discount the existence of a God. And that's a bit of a problem. There's a Jewish rabbi who wrote a book about why do bad things happen to good people, because his son was born with a disaster, an aging condition, which meant by the time he reached adolescence, his son would have the appearance of an old man, and he died at 15. And we can look at any lists of disasters in the natural world, and it opens this big question. Why is it that God seems, if he does exist, to suffer, to bring about calamities on his own children? Yeah. Which is why Christians go to the book of Job.
Tell me about you going back to the book of Job. What inspired you to write this book? What did you learn while writing this book?
I followed Barton in great depth. And I've also read around the subject first. And it led him to become an atheist. He was, I suppose, quite a fundamentalist Christian, an evangelical, and he believed the word of God in the Bible, word for word, unquestionable. But all the time his students kept throwing this question, why is it that bad things seem to happen? And so he wrote a book. I studied that book, and I, as a Christian myself, I couldn't come round to the view that God doesn't exist. I think we have to wrestle with the subject, which is why I read round it. I read lots of philosophers, and various philosophers have a view. And so I thought, I'm going to have a go at writing this. I've written other books before. And so I looked at, in the first part of the book, about what do philosophers say about suffering? What do psychologists say about suffering? Does it serve a positive purpose? And then we ended up, as we do in the book, we explore the book of Job and ask this question. Does the book of Job, in which Christians often refer to, give the answer? And I'm not so sure that it does.
Yeah. And for the folks at home who might not be that familiar with the story of Job, Job was a rich man who was a good man, who did good things for people, and his life is basically destroyed. He is challenged by Satan, who believes that he is only good because he lives a rich, full life. But once his children are taken away, his wealth are taken away, his health is taken away, he still refuses to curse God. Why do you think he refused to curse God?
Well, let me first, before I answer that, just say this. Any kind of argument is based upon the premise. How do you begin? Firstly, we'll look at the book of Job as it stands. The book of Job has had a long transmission. It is a very, very ancient book, but parts of the book are much newer than the oldest part of the book. There are many books in the Bible that didn't just land as a finished product, but they had a process of transmission. And sometimes the narratives have been altered and edited by different groups of, as in the case of the Old Testament, Jewish rabbis. Now, when we come to the book of Job, there is a prologue and there's an epilogue. And those are the oldest parts of the book. The book is divided between they're almost sandwiched as a sandwich in the middle of which there are a series of poems. It's basically a man who is a nomad. He's presented as a nomad, but he's also presented as a sage of wisdom. He suffers tremendous loss. He has something like about 10,000 sheep, and he has thousands of donkeys and camels and stuff. And he has servants, and he has 7 sons and daughters and so on. and he suffers the loss overnight, the lot. And then when we look at the epilogue of the book, God appears to give him this answer in which God is saying, this is the way I've created the universe. It is a mystery. And because Job was always faithful, he's rewarded at the end. And that's why Christians favor the book. But unfortunately, that's not the simplest way of interpreting the book. Because in the middle, there's a series of poems. And the poems give a very different picture than the, if you like, the prologue and the epilogue. The prologue and the epilogue present a picture that if you're good, you'll be blessed. And if you're not so good, things won't be so good. And there's a book of Proverbs that makes that point. But then there's another book in the Old Testament called the book of Ecclesiastes that says the opposite. It says there's no difference between the way God deals with people, whether they're good or bad. So which is the right answer? It looks as though the book of Job was attempting to answer that. So he took this ancient myth, this ancient story of this man, Job, wise man of the East, nomad, who was visited by three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And they sit for quiet silence with him as he suffers these losses. And then they have these series of debates. Firstly, Job pours out his soul. Why was I born? He wished the earth would have opened and cursed him, and he would never have existed. That's a big question, that he would never have existed. And then people say, well, maybe, Job, you're not quite as good as you think you are. Another person in the poem, he says that maybe God is teaching you something. These are the kind of arguments that Christians often use.
Yeah.
All the way through, Job says no, and he disagrees, and he challenges God. He holds God as responsible for what's happened, not Satan. He doesn't accuse Satan. And, well, God eventually gives this great dramatic appearance where he comes and visits Job, and he says, where were you, Job, when I questioned? And he's giving him a hard time. Reduces him to nothing. And the poor old man Job then, because God says at the end of the book, he says, because you have answered correctly. When he questioned God, that was the point. The point of the poems, he questions God throughout. But in the epilogue, he doesn't do that. He accepts what God has said. And that's a big mystery.
Might be a little bit of revisionist history, like you said, as time went along and people
the book expounds that. It sort of develops a theory. I'm not going to give the answer because the answer's there in the book. It's a teaser. It's a whodunit sort of kind of detective story, but it's also very theologically sound.
It is indeed. It's a wonderful book. It's called Consider Job, an Enquiry concerning suffering, disbelief, and divine justice. It is written by Dennis Lyons. It is a remarkable book. It's a remarkable exploration of fundamental questions of philosophy, theology, and faith. And I highly recommend it. If you're not thinking on this plane, you need to be. And I'm going to leave Dennis with one final question today. And that is this, because you seem to be such a learned person when it comes to this subject. Do you believe in divine intervention?
Yes. We wouldn't live in a universe as complex as it is without it.
So our prayers are answered from time to time, and God will intervene in different events?
I believe that God spoke through his son, Jesus of Nazareth, the prophet. I'm not too sure whether he was the son of God, but I'm convinced that God used him as an instrument to develop it is the signs. I've written another book on that, about the historical Jesus. What's the real evidence? What's the real evidence of Saul of Tarsus, the Apostle Paul? Again, I'm interested in theology as a sound basis, and so that there's some way of bridging together the atheist and the believer.
Wonderful. Well, that's another book to look forward to. This is a terrific book here at the holiday season. Christmas is coming up, the birth of Jesus. It's a time to explore your faith a little bit. This is a wonderful book to do that. It is called Consider Job. It is written by Dennis Lyons. It's highly recommended by the Spotlight. Dennis, thank you so much for joining us here today.
All my books are available on my own website, and which I think.
And your website is what, sir?
It's called Daimler Publishing. Daimler, DAIMLER, DaimlerPublishing.com.
Wonderful, wonderful. We will look for that website. We'll actually have it on your screen throughout this interview. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight. And Dennis, I want to wish you a wonderful day and a wonderful Christmas season.
Good to speak to you. Thank you.
Merry Christmas. And I'm Logan Crawford. Until next time.
Thank you.